Okay, so we are going to talk about the carbon cycle in these notes, and I am going to try to get my camera back here. Here we go. So we'll go back to the slideshow. All right, so let's talk about our objectives here for this. We're going to be talking about the carbon cycle and the movement of atoms and molecules. Then we're going to talk about carbon reservoirs and what a reservoir is, and how the carbon cycles between photosynthesis and respiration in living things. And then lastly, we'll talk about how plant and animal decomposition has led to the storage of carbon over millions of years. And then from burning fossil fuels, we're putting a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so first thing here, let's do a carbon cycle overview because I know you learn about photosynthesis and respiration in biology your freshman year. But I just want to do a quick review. So, the carbon cycle is the movement of molecules that contain carbon. So, CO2, glucose, CH4, which is methane. That's what we get when we burn organic material. And it is the movement of those molecules between sources of carbon and sinks or areas where we store carbon. And so some of these steps are very quick. So this carbon can be released and moves very quickly. So imagine burning any kind of fossil fuel, gasoline, oil, those sorts of things, burning that coal, even burning that, and then the carbon would be released very quickly. But then some are very slow. So sedimentation is the buildup of organic material or carbon-based material in the ground until it forms rocks. And then burial is when an organism or something like that is buried. And then over time, that eventually turns into some sort of a carbon-based rock or mineral. Okay, so looking at this picture, we can see the steps here of the carbon cycle. So it kind of starts with producers converting CO2 into C6H12O6 or glucose. And then from there, sugars are converted, that glucose is converted back into CO2. And that's an example would be us breathing out CO2. And so that's just a cycle that happens over and over from producers to consumers to decomposers. And then this goes into the atmosphere when we breathe it out. And then it can also be dissolved into the ocean here, into the waterways, and it can move through food webs within the ocean. And then we also see examples of burning fossil fuels over, this sedimentary rock that builds up. We can end up getting fossil fuels out of the ground. And when we burn that, we can put atmospheric CO2 back into the atmosphere. So this leads to an imbalance in which reservoirs or sinks are storing carbon. And one of the major or main reservoirs of carbon is the atmosphere. There is a ton of carbon in the atmosphere in the form of CO2. And the issue is that we're increasing those levels of carbon in the atmosphere, which can actually lead to global warming or climate change, which is what we're seeing right now. Carbon sinks are reservoirs that take in more carbon than it releases. So a reservoir, the difference between a reservoir and a sink is a reservoir stores whatever it is that we're talking about, whichever geochemical that we're talking about. A sink actually takes in more and stores more than it is releasing. And so that's the major difference there. The ocean is one of the carbon sinks. It takes in way more carbon than it's releasing. Plants and soil are other examples. And carbon sources are reservoirs that release more carbon than they take in. So we have sinks and we have sources. One source that I think of right away is fossil fuels. Actually, are a source, and they're a reservoir that are definitely releasing more carbon than they're taking in because it's a very slow process. Animal agriculture, like cow burps and farts, kind of gross, but they release methane gas. And then lastly, deforestation. It releases a lot of CO2 from trees when we cut those trees down. Okay, so again, understanding the difference between photosynthesis and respiration. We just put a little graphic up here. I put a little graphic up here for you to see so that you can see the differences here. Photosynthesis is done by plants, algae, and some bacteria, whereas respiration is performed by all other organisms. Okay, so photosynthesis removes CO2 from the atmosphere and it converts it to glucose. That's the overall idea of what's happening. And then glucose is the biological form of carbon that is stored as chemical energy in the form of sugar. Again, it's C6H12O6. You can see it here in the equation. And then photosynthesis is an example of a carbon sink. All right, respiration is done by plants and animals. It uses O2 or oxygen to break glucose down and then release energy in the form of ATP. And it releases CO2 into the atmosphere, and it's a CO2 source. It adds CO2 to the atmosphere. So both processes are very quick. They happen all the time. Every time you breathe in and out, and actually all of your cells are going through respiration right now. And it also cycles carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere. Biosphere, we learned in 1.1, is kind of where all life is on the planet. And then the atmosphere is the air above us. Okay, well, I think it's important to note that when this is happening, it is in balance. Okay, so there's no net carbon increase in the atmosphere just based on life that's on the planet. What happens is we've got this artificial, like, burning of fossil fuels that puts way too much carbon into the atmosphere, and it's not balanced. Okay, so the ocean and atmosphere. When we're talking about the ocean, I don't think folks realize right away that there's a direct exchange of gases from the atmosphere to the ocean. So CO2 can move directly from the atmosphere and the ocean by dissolving into and out of ocean water at the surface. This happens very quickly. It happens in equal directions. It's usually balanced. So as much CO2 is going into the ocean is the same or equal to the amount that's leaving the ocean. Okay, and you can kind of see this in this diagram here. Because of this direct exchange, it's increasing the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and it can so if there's an increase, let me say this again. If there's an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, there's going to be an increase in oceanic carbon dioxide. And so this leads to something called ocean acidification. Because we have this carbon dioxide gas going into and mixing with H2O or water, it causes us to create a solution called carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid is causing the pH of the oceans to increase, or we get a lower pH on the pH scale. And that's very, very harmful to the organisms that live there. So algae and phytoplankton are examples of organisms in the ocean that take CO2 out of the ocean and atmosphere through photosynthesis. Coral, mollusks, and zooplankton are also other organisms that can take CO2 out of the ocean to help. They use that they use that carbon to make what we call calcium carbonate, which is basically a seashell. That's what a seashell is made out of. Sedimentation is another example of calcium carbonate that precipitates out as sediment, and it settles on the ocean floor. So again, it leads to this ocean being a reservoir of carbon. And then burial over long periods of time. Pressure of the water compresses that sediment that's at the bottom of the ocean, and it creates something called sedimentary rock. Examples of sedimentary rock include limestone and sandstone. This is a long-term carbon reservoir, but the ocean can only take so much carbon out of the atmosphere. All right, so burial. Burial is a very slow geologic process that stores carbon in underground sinks like sedimentary rock or fossil fuels. And so these sediments get compacted, like we just kind of previously mentioned, into these sedimentary rock by pressure. And the rock just keeps building up with layers and layers and layers, or the water keeps building up with layers and layers and layers. And so we also have fossil fuels. These are formed from fossilized remains of organic matter into coal. So we have plants that die back when the dinosaurs were around, or we have plankton that dies back when the dinosaurs were around. The plankton floats to the bottom of the ocean. The plants lay on the ground over time because of erosion and sedimentation, sediments building up. They cover the plants, they cover the plankton. Over millions of years, we end up getting coal from those plants or oil from that plankton. Their decomposition produces something called natural gas, which is CH4. And so that's how we end up getting natural gas that we can burn in our furnaces at our houses, actually. So, all right, and then here's this whole process. You can see this nice picture of this process here. Okay. And then lastly, another way that we get CO2 into the atmosphere is by extraction of these fossil fuels and also combustion. So when we dig up or mine, which is that extraction piece, we actually release carbon into the atmosphere. And also when we burn these fossil fuels, we get carbon into the atmosphere that way as well. That's happening at such a rate that the natural processes of moving that carbon just can't keep up with the rate that we're putting it into the atmosphere. And so burial takes far longer than extraction and combustion. Burial takes way too long. That's the issue. So basically, then what's going on is that we're increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, it's really important that you understand that process of the carbon cycle. Here's a practice FRQ for you to try to apply the knowledge that you learned. So you're going to identify one process in this diagram that happens quickly and one process that happens slowly. Explain then how the rate at which fossil fuels are transferred into the atmosphere, as shown in the diagram, has altered the carbon cycle during the past 250 years. Okay, we'll see you in our next set of notes.